Please return to your seats. The show will now begin. Name subject to change. Ad infinitum. A story of absolutes and those who seek to understand them. Story by Asea, Ea, Alethea, Eliona, Lylan. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is coincidental. Act 1. Luna's Reminiscence. The Voice of Blasphemy. Scene 1. God spoke to me. Scene 2. I remember that moment very clearly. At that time, I had been kneeling at my bed, offering up a prayer for guidance in that trying moment of my life. The company I had been working for had fallen apart. From what I knew, there had been corruption in the upper ranks that I was a part of. I had been implicated in the perpetration, on summary the scapegoat. Or, that is to say, I wish I were the only one to take the blame. I wasn't so worried about myself as I was for the rest of my department leaders. Olivia, Varen, Theo, Robin, Sophia, and Eden were all suspects as well. There was evidence against us. Granted, evidence that couldn't have possibly existed. And yet it did. There was no way I could have perfectly refuted all the claims against us, not even the ones against me alone. They ranged from small mistakes on my part to overarching schemes and plots linking the 7 of us as co-conspirators. They were on me, on the part of my colleagues in leadership, of those under me. So many were negligible alone, but clearly connected in an all-encompassing scope. I knelt as I prayed, and I prayed so fervently that I felt my eyes burn over in shame. I had been devout. I wasn't perfect, but I have endeavored to be as reverent as any reasonable person could have been expected to be. But perhaps this was my inevitable punishment for the myriad of small mistakes I had committed to. For failing to attend to chapel when I was ill, for paying insufficient alms during those masses I had been able to attend, for keeping quiet in the face of sin so to avoid conflict, for holding my tongue as others spread doubt about my beliefs. Guiltily, I had ignored homeless when I had nothing on hand to spare them. Shamefully, I questioned the existence of a higher power as part of thought experiments. I had asked questions I never should have asked. I remember thinking of the countless mistakes I had committed as I prayed for guidance and mercy, and I remember resigning myself to my fate, even as I asked for leniency from my fiancé and friends. That though I was undeserving, surely they could be forgiven their sins and spared this impending trial. Towards this end, I prayed so fervently that my body shook as my eyes wet the cloth of the bed I knelt at. A holy symbol around my neck, once a symbol of which I could take pride in, now a weight filled with regret and agony, threatening to strangle the life from me with the string that held it around my neck. And at that time, God spoke to me. Scene 3. It was overwhelming. Scene 4. The words echoed through me as a whisper of a summer breeze, as the roar of a volcanic eruption. They caressed my body with the gentle touch of snowbells' petals and with the biting ice of an eternal winter. They were in every language, and every language was them. They were impossible to understand, and yet it was impossible to have misunderstood them. And as fear and joy and horror and ecstasy coursed through me, they made themselves clear. A divine mandate. that my current trial was but a stepping stone, a sign of things to come, that I, as well as the others, were destined for something far greater. And so they commanded me to select for them a myriad of peoples from across every race and nation, to form a holy city erected upon a hill, a star upon the world, and through them they would bring about a new age. I heard these all and more, visions of a grand future with all peoples finally united under one banner, the end of suffering and struggling as a concept spoken of in history books, an explosion of cultures and sciences, and an acceptance of all peoples and races as they were, and will be, that each and all were simply one of many, and many were simply one. And so I felt the departing twilight of the world's first end, and heard the oncoming dawn of the final beginning, an end to all ends, eternity within our grasp. And I was filled with excitement and anticipation I had never known before. This I heard, as the voice did so decree, and it departed me then. Scene 5. I returned to myself, and I was yet kneeling. Gone was the fear and regret that so plagued my heart. In its place was something far greater. I knew my path then and there, and how I would follow it. In my encounter I gained a clarity of mind I had never felt before, and the problems with my bespoken company now seemed so simple. So the same could be said of the accusations against my fiancé, my friends, even of me, everything, trivial in the face of the true goal I now knew and understood to have. The annihilation of that voice of blasphemy. Interlude 1. Silverd's Reminiscence. The First Reverie. Scene 1. At that time, a forest spoke with me. Scene 2. For all the time I'd spent in the heavens, and for all the times I'd spoken with the Eternia, their voice has never been anything less than indescribable. This, even after I had transcended. I can only imagine that, if any mortal had been so blessed enough to hear them, they would have instantly ceased the function as any other mortal could have described it. Needless to say, they have always used a proxy of some sort to speak to those mortals, be it through someone like myself speaking in their stead or giving a voice to an inanimate object. At least twice they've gone so far as to send a personal creation of theirs to live and speak as one of them, a mortal. Though, as I am given to admit for having spoken with them so often, perhaps I'd become used to that overwhelming sensation, and so I was able to parse the meaning from their words. The Eternia asked me what I had done. The Eternia asked me whether what I had done was truly necessary. That of the nigh immeasurably and countless possible futures I could have chosen, I'd selected possibly the singular batch where I could cease to exist. They asked me why I had chosen these futures, and I answered that I wanted to see those mortals to the future I had once dreamt of. The future that I had never been able to see attained myself. The Ardents watched us, standing ready to act on any command, to undo the choice I had made, perhaps even to cast me down. But the order never came. The Eternia turned away, leaving me to the fate and future I had chosen, and the Ardents followed in their steps. Scene 3. At that time, I heard their words. So be it. Interlude 2. Sapphire's Reminiscence. The Second Reverie. Scene 1. The Ardents are nearest to the Eternia. Scene 2. The Eternia turned and left the silver to their fate. Though we are Ardents, we yet dare not question the will of the Eternia, but we are not without a mind. A single glance toward the other Ardents would reveal an obvious pressing concern. The Eternia can change anything and achieve everything with a simple declaration, nay, a thought, if one can describe a divine mandate as such. With this in mind, the question was thus: why allow the Silvered to make such an edit in their grand design? Furthermore, why allow that edit to persist when it could result in the end of the Silvered? A Silvered, after all, is still one of the Eternia's chosen. Simply Silvered they may be, but chosen nonetheless. The Eternia would know the doubts we harbored. It was impossible for them not to know. And yet, when it came time for us to leave their side, they still hadn't addressed our thoughts. Loomis stepped forward and broke our silence, speaking to the Eternia, a farewell as the rest of us knelt. And, at that moment, the Eternia paused and turned towards us and spoke to us. The first words they had spoken since they asked the Silver to explain themselves. Scene 3. May this serve as a lesson. Act 2. Olivia's Reminiscence. The Absolute Philosophy. Scene 1. There were 7 of us. Scene 2. I was not the only one to have been so tempted by the voice of blasphemy. Upon speaking to my friends, they revealed that they, too, had experienced a delusion. However, only Luna had understood right away that the voice was not so divine as it had claimed to be, and they wasted no expense in explaining it to me and the rest of those beholden that fell prophecy. Myself, aside, Varen, Theo, Robin, and Sophia came to realize that which couldn't have possibly made sense, though they had been blinded by awe before. It was a simple matter of, if it were truly God, we couldn't have never understood them. And yet, as Luna explained, somehow we did. A voice that we somehow understood, visions that were not entirely indecipherable, sounds more than incomprehensible noise. While believing in and of itself, what mattered is that we all experienced the same message, and we all understood it. They spoke of God, but that selfsame God would have been impossible to understand in the state of the human condition we were confined to. An imperfect construct cannot possibly understand something perfect, the ultimate and absolute forever beyond the comprehension of something lesser and dependent. The simple fact that we understood anything it showed us was proof enough. Whatever had spoken to us could not have been God. But at the same time, the miraculousness of the experience was similarly proof that there were things beyond our comprehension, and, inevitably, God. It was simply a matter of finding that which blasphemed, and to destroy it before it usurped God's plan, whatever it may have truly been. Scene 3. Eden was the only one of us who did not readily trust in everything that Luna claimed. They agreed with our conclusion that the voice could not be God, but claimed to worry that what we experienced might not have been blasphemy. It was not an unreasonable concern, and so we rescinded our intent to destroy the voice of blasphemy until we had ascertained its true purpose. Scene 4. We did not rescind our intent. Eden had always been one easily swayed by thoughts of utopias, of paradise. Idealistic to a fault, they were beholden to extremes of both patience and, at times, ruthlessness. It was admirable, but also pitiful, and at times unsettling. Countless were the times that we had seen Eden taken advantage of, be those intentions pure and unsavory, and we could have only assumed that this was one of those moments. It wasn't as if we believed that such a paradise was impossible. It was something that each and all of us dreamed of. However, Eden was the only one of us who would lose sight of everything else in pursuit of that paradise. And so it was up to us to protect them from the cruel realities of the world, to guide their hands, capable of achievements nearing miraculous. Luna would discuss the logistics of such a paradise with them. Varen would discuss the personal rights and freedoms of individuals in such a paradise with them. Theo would discuss the possible governments that could affect such a paradise with them. Robin would discuss the various laws that might be necessary to effect such a paradise with them. Sophia would discuss how true equality might be achieved in such a paradise with them, and I would discuss the various concepts in which a paradise would be based with them. But they needed to be protected. If we needed to lie to them in order to do so, then we would do so. Unsavory, but a necessary sacrifice. Scene 5. We discussed there how we would draw out that voice, that we would endeavor to satisfy the conditions that the voice set forth to the best of our abilities, and once it manifested we would subdue that voice. As powerful as its owner could be, the fact of the matter was that the voice was not God. We were able to perceive it and understand it, and therefore it was not perfect. It was not absolute. It was not ultimate. It was not eternal. We would strip the voice of blasphemy of its delusions and bring it down to terra. Interlude 3. Rodon's Reminiscence. The Third Reverie. Scene 1. Each ardent governs an element and a concept. Scene 2. I watched the Silvered as they set about their work after the Eternia gave them their assignment, to set in motion a future that they desired. It was something I didn't quite understand, but eventually concluded that the Silvered they selected was doubtlessly fulfilling the Eternia's plan. However, after watching the Silvered make their rounds, I watched as the people they spoke to quickly become incensed against their intervention. 6 of the 7 quickly doubted the Silver's purpose, going so far to mistake them with someone attempting to impersonate the Eternia. I couldn't help but be confused. The Eternia, being capable of seeing all futures, had yet allowed this to happen. Even now I think to myself, perhaps this was the lesson that the Eternia intended to teach. Needless to say, even before I knew that this was a lesson, I'd expected the Eternia to immediately order us Ardents to remedy the problem, but such an order never came. The Eternia merely turned away and maintained their silence until they left, at which point they said that this was a lesson. It was an affront to justice, such was my very first reaction. But if the Eternia did nothing to remedy the situation, perhaps my notion of justice had been faulty. Perhaps the Eternia's course of action was true justice. The Eternia was beholden to things I could never comprehend, and as a result it was all I could do to trust in their judgment, and I would always trust in their judgment. Scene 3. I watched the Silvered as they set in motion their fate and future. Interlude 4. Terror's Reminiscence. The Fourth Reverie. Scene 1. An Ardent is not limited to their element and concept. Scene 2. On one hand, I might have said that the Silvered was stepping beyond their station by making known their voice to those 7 mortals, but the Eternia had never said anything against it. Nevertheless, they had made mistakes that were difficult to understand. There were certain procedures to be followed to ensure proper receipt of a prophecy, and the Silvered had skipped over those procedures. The obvious result, of course, was that the most intelligent of the 7 quickly determined that the Silvered was not, in fact, a divine being speaking to them, but some sort of flawed facsimile, attempting to fool them into sin. And now there were 7 mortals plotting to fulfill the prophecy to draw the Silvered out, and of those 7, 6 intended to somehow subdue them. Similarly, those mortals would be acting beyond their station. But the Eternia had never said anything against it. In fact, they hadn't said anything at all beside asking the Silver what they intended to do, and that this scenario was to serve as a lesson. Rodon would doubtlessly be struggling to accept the situation. They were to stand by and watch as a Silver, one of the Eternia's chosen, albeit a lower chosen, possibly consign themselves to the void. It was of little concern to me, of course, so long as everything acted as they were expected to. There was nothing to trouble me. Scene 3. On the other hand, I might have said that I was curious about the Silvered's intents. Act 3. Varen's Reminiscence. The Seven Unbound. Scene 1. We swept away the lies that bound us. Scene 2. Even if that voice had been blasphemous, it was undeniable that, after it had spoken to us, we had been changed. One moment we had been paralyzed by doubt, and trapped in the future that had been set out for us by others, but in the next moment we were free, the wires and chains of lies and deceit having come undone, and we saw them for what they truly were. What was once incomprehensible had become something to be understood by even a child, even if we knew otherwise. We did not dare forget that we had failed to understand. Our first goal was to pick apart those claims against us, and so we did. We appeared in courts as necessary and produced impossible evidences. Impossible if only for the reason that they were supposed to have been destroyed. But of course it was company policy to retain several copies of such important documents in case of such a situation. We had simply gone about retrieving those documents. And in the case of documents that truly had ceased to exist, it wasn't as if we were the only ones affected by the schemes of corruption. We found allies wherever we tread, a voice of the masses calling out in support of the unjustly condemned. In the end, there was a settlement. Of course, it wouldn't do to strip them entirely of their fortunes. It wasn't as if they had nothing else of value. Instead, we stepped out and took the places that they had sought to vacate during the dissolution. And how readily they surrendered their seats. It was an impossible task to revitalize such a failing company as ours, and it would still make off with the profits we were so foolish to have forgiven them. Scene 3. Of course, it wasn't so simple as that. By giving us their power, they had similarly given us their freedom, an unforgiving truth of the world. In order to truly possess freedom, one must have the power to seize it. They might have escaped with their profits, but such meager gains pale in comparison to the might of a human being. Or, in other words, they had possessed the world, and they had so naively given it away. We were not ones to turn away such a benevolent gift. Scene 4. I remember speaking with our employees after that time. They were concerned with us in our positions, shaken by the activities of our priors. As I spent time with them, I heard their worries and their complaints, their own trials and tribulations. The human condition is difficult, and yet those determined masses struggled against all odds set before them to achieve even an inkling of happiness. Perhaps for themselves, perhaps for others, admirable all the same. And as I sat and listened to them, I understood what needed to be done. I selected a number of them. These would sit in our discussions and offer their views and opinions, their ideas and innovations. The next day I selected another number of them, and I did the same for every day after. For as many ideas that were offered, countless would be turned away, but these countless paled in comparison to the value of a single innovation that we found to be worthy. It was a necessary sacrifice, and so we cycled them through our council day by day as we fought to stabilize the failing company. How grim the outlook of the persons who stepped through our doors, how fervently they offered their best solutions, absolutely admirable, each of them to the last, but also bereft of hope. And suddenly, all at once, the problems had come to their end. We found the last of the debt to be paid, the last of the regulations to enforce, the last of the complaints to be fielded, and suddenly we were left but nothing, but freedom. I took this moment to offer a quiet announcement, a passing formal email that the company had been stabilized, that we would begin to see about raising salaries where we could. A passing word of gratitude, and a request that those who had worked so hard up until now continue their heroic efforts. Scene 5. We continued to cycle our employees through our council. They continued to offer their ideas and innovations. With the last of the challenges stripped away, nothing had changed, and life in the company continued on as normal. Wages and salaries were raised without warning, without celebration. There was no need for such extravagant measures, for we must be vigilant in protecting our freedom. Though if there was indeed one tangible change, it was certainly thus. Those persons who passed through our council were no longer bereft of hope, and they glowed with pride. Interlude 5. Verdant's Reminiscence. The Fifth Reverie. Scene 1. Each ardent possesses a title and a name. Scene 2. Watching the silvered could only prove to be nothing less than fascinating, is what I continued to tell myself. What they intended to do, at least according to what I determined, could only prove to be nothing less than an exercise in futility. But then again, judging by their lack of further action, perhaps this is what they had intended. Similarly, judging by the Eternia's lack of action, perhaps this is all part of their plan. Though I doubt I could ever guess its intent outside of serving as a lesson. Perhaps this was the reason I couldn't help but speak to the silvered that day. An eccentric sort of curiosity, to say the least. It wasn't as if it were something I couldn't do, after all. And when I spoke to them, I asked what their name was. Everyone had a name, whether it was given to them or whether they had chosen it themselves. At least according to what the Eternia had said. Perhaps Eternia is the Eternia's name, but I digress. The silvered simply smiled and said it was enough that they were called silvered. How easy to remember. Scene 3. I envied the confidence in which the silvered spoke the title we had given them. Interlude 6. Onyx's Reminiscence. The Sixth Reverie. Scene 1. Only the Ardents may address each other by their names. Scene 2. At that time I had watched the silvered as I stood with Loomis, and for all the dusks of the world that we watched the silvered, they never ceased to fascinate me. And for all the dawns of the world below that we watched the silvered, they never ceased to bewilder me. I thought back on their words, before we had called the Eternia, when I had asked why they were so content to be misunderstood. The silvered spoke thus. O ardent of the dark, I am not content with being misunderstood. Alas, I am content with having been heard, and I have been heard. In this way the mortals shall reach the future that I once dreamt of, though I can only hope I shall yet exist to see it. And yet, with the paths and futures they had elected to guide those selfsame mortals towards, there existed futures in which the silvered no longer existed. And before my very eyes, these futures continued to narrow, until there only remained futures in which the silver had ceased to exist. Content with both existence, yet similarly resigned to possible cessation of that existence, they spoke to the mortal septum but once, and they had been content to be misunderstood and called blasphemous, even as they spoke of the paradise they wanted to create, a contentedness with dystopia while dreaming of utopia. If this malice was what they intended to create, they had certainly succeeded in that regard, and yet such ambitious malice was impossible for anyone but the Eternia to predict. Perhaps the Eternia knew this, but they saw fit not to soothe my concern. It was all I could do to be patient, but patience did not lend itself to grace me with its calm. How enthralling the color of the single silvered's existence! How tragic that inevitable end! Scene 3. I knew not their name, and yet how desperately did I wish they would speak mine. Act 4. Theo's Reminiscence. The Misguided World. Scene 1. We united our world. Scene 2. How easy it is to manipulate a singular person. But how difficult to take the reins of a world locked in perpetual conflict. Though, this stated, how logical it is that such a world would be racked by such conflict. An individual is connected to their peers, but not so connected to strangers. Given a person from a second settlement and given to a neighbor, how often would an individual choose to spare the neighbor when faced with the command to kill one of them? Or perhaps kill is too strong a word, and how often an act is perpetrated without true value. Perhaps it would be better to say steal from. When the entire world is neighbors, however, becomes less so a matter of a neighbor versus a stranger, it becomes a neighbor versus another neighbor, requiring a different but similar method of consideration, an assessment of value per se. Which neighbors do I wish to be deeper friends with? Which neighbors have more to offer me than the others? Which neighbors have the ability to resist my otherwise indomitable will? Which neighbors will the others care about? Which neighbors have which strategic values? Summarily, an assessment of worth. But with a catch, in this, and that the valued assessment of one neighbor may not match those of another neighbor. Take, for example, the nuclear struggles of the 22nd century. Even for having happened more than 200 years prior, those times are still called back to as an example of potentially fatal conflicts of values. Perhaps it was all for the best, however. The struggles and disagreements eventually led to a worldwide discontinuance of the use of such inefficient methods of both power and destruction. This, of course, has made it far easier for me and my peers to wrest control from the otherwise less efficient leaders, especially those who still harbor resentments over mistakes perpetuated by their ancestors. Scene 3. Perhaps such resentment is reasonable. However, it is only to be expected when those nuclear struggles led to the end of several nations, be they among the stars or perhaps down on Terra. I need not mention the loss of life, which numbered not beyond the millions, reaching easily into the billions. Tangible is the grief, even in present day, and fear for a potential resurgence of such vile hostilities. Grief and fear that we were able to take advantage of to take control. How unhappy that we were able to take advantage of such grief and fear. What opportunity exists to be taken advantage of? At least we would prevent such a relapse. Scene 4. We told the world not our true goals, that we intended to create a utopia for the sake of drawing out the voice of blasphemy from beyond the barriers of a tangible reality. Instead, we cited and summarized an otherwise unfathomable fusillade of goals that we intended to have our company achieve, goals that would lead into other goals. We would progress our people far beyond what we had thus far been limited to. We needed not control over the various nations, only faith and patience that we had already established the necessary groundwork in our company for us to reach beyond the stars. Sometimes I thought to myself how far we had come. A group of 7 individuals, normal in every way, trying their best for a company that probably didn't care about them. And yet we tried our best nonetheless, until that company decided to throw us aside in the pursuit of ultimate profit. A voice spoke to us then, describing a world beyond our wildest dreams, showing us what we thought was impossible, and one of our own elucidated us to the truth of that voice. Indeed, it could not have been anything but the speak of the devil, and that to bring the world fully into that vaunted paradise we would need to usurp that ultimate evil. We would act in the name of the one true God, a God that we would never be able to fully understand for the sheer reason that they are absolute, and that we are not. We made the company ours, and we grew beyond what we ever used to be. We expanded, diversified, optimized, universalized, all consolidated and controlled under one single ideal, advancement of our civilization. We became zealots for a world with no need for God-given miracles. For such miracles we would make ourselves. We became fanatics for a world with no needs for deals with the devil, for we could make far more progress without relying on another. And surely, ever so surely, we would create a world where all were truly equal, a utopia through which we would draw out the voice of blasphemy. Scene 5. We turned our eyes toward the stars, and we set forth on an ultimate odyssey, with the one final goal set deep within our hearts and minds. The world had no need for such wasteful things such as entropy, and so we would control everything. All would be calculated, controlled, down to the very last atom in the wavelength of energy. Satisfaction with utopia was what the voice of blasphemy wanted. The only true path to paradise would be the search beyond it, beyond such paltry satisfaction. It was a deal with the devil, and we would not be fooled. Fission, fusion, matter and antimatter, all of this would mean nothing in the face of the voice of blasphemy when that final confrontation came. In order to cleanse such a corrupted existence, we need to look beyond our mortal coils. For that purpose, we had but one recourse: to harness the power of the stars themselves. Interlude 7. Lumisus Reminiscence. The Seventh Reverie. Only the ardents may refer to God as the Eternia. Scene 2. And lo and behold, before mine eyes, I watched as the stars themselves began to darken, the mortals aspiring once more to a world they had no claim to. But how prepared they had become since they first constructed that hollowed tower so many countless cycles ago. I walked among the rest of the silvered and listened to them. Is this not what God wanted to prevent? Is this truly part of God's plan? Is this not blasphemy? Why would God allow this? I revealed myself to them as I quieted them. This was indeed part of the Eternia's plan. They needed only remain faithful. And I stood silent as the Eternia's chosen silvered effected their works. And yet, despite mine self and mine encouraging words, I was but fearful. The last future that the esteemed onyx had spoken to me was thus: that it would take a millennia for the mortals to aspire to something as great as this. Alas, behold! They had achieved such a monument within a mere century since setting out to the stars. But when I spoke to the Eternia, they had yet said nothing more. How I wished I could search their face for an answer, but how brilliant they were that even us ardents could not see their face. And I felt shame, and I apologized for failing to be faithful. And they spoke to me then: Lift up your head, Loomis. Blessed art thou that your faith led you to ask. Do not be ashamed. You have been and are yet blessed. Scene 3. I could only wonder how far I have drifted from the Eternia to have ever doubted them. Interlude 8. Silver's Reminiscence. The Eighth Reverie. Scene 1. At that time, I spoke with Afara. Scene 2. They called me away at that time, and the Ardents stepped in to watch over the mortals in my stead. I knew that they collectively didn't understand what I intended to do, but they didn't need to understand it. By sheer virtue of their natures, they would play their parts correctly when the time came. There was no recourse for them other than to play those parts. At this point, as the futures gradually narrowed down, only Afara could have any say in how the future would come to pass, a machination of their divine will if I dared say so. But they wouldn't construe such a machination. This I already knew. Just as they had when they first called me to enact the future I wished to see, they gauged my worth as I stood before them. Their brilliance was blinding me. But perhaps I had become used to it. They asked me once again, at that time, whether this was truly the path that I intended to guide the mortals toward. I bowed before them, and I reaffirmed my determination. This was the dream I had held since long before I was silvered, even if I no longer existed to see it. Knowing that I have effected that its passing would be satisfaction enough. Silence grew between us, and Afara acknowledged me. Scene 3. Elysium. Scene 4. I turned toward Afara when I heard the name that I had long since given up, the name given to me when I first came into existence on Earth, long before that name was lost to the ages and became known as Terra. I can still remember the names of my parents, of my grandparents, of my siblings, of my children, and their children ad infinitum. When we transcended, I bestowed upon them only fever dreams of a glorious future, a future filled with happiness and peace, a future where worry had become a concept of the past forgotten to the history books. Alas, my line had ended with the rest of the world, with the rest of civilization. From that desolate world, Afara saw fit to raise up a new line, the first cycle after the world had gone dark. From that first cycle there came to rise 6 ardents who attained the concept of absolute and ascended. And soon after their revered ascension, the world saw its end. But unlike before, civilization yet persisted. Guided by the ideals of the ardents who ascended, so began the second cycle. And, like the first, eventually there came 6 ardents, who eventually assumed the role of the ardents prior. And the world saw once again its end. And thus began the third cycle. And thus began the fourth, the fifth, ad infinitum. There was never a 7th ardent. Long had the dreams of paradise perished, and those dreams would never return. All that remained was a quiet and commonplace understanding that the world had come to its end. Once, twice, thrice, countless times confined to its refrain, ad infinitum. The ardents do not know this. The time when they would know has yet to pass, and thus they cannot know, and thus their confusion. They could only ever know what the world would ask of them when it did. I gazed towards the Eternia then, and I heard their words. Scene 5. The future you dreamed of will come to pass. Your wish is granted by your own hands. I am the one called Elysium, ardent Eternia of paradise, governor of infinity. I shall see the world to the future I was never privileged to see, a future that has no end, ad infinitum. Thank you for your patience. I'll now be taking a moment to rest my voice. Take this time to relax. Please return to your seats. The show will resume shortly. Please return to your seats. The show will now resume. Act 5. Robin's Reminiscence. The End of Blasphemy. Scene 1. We pass judgment on the voice of blasphemy. Scene 2. Count thee the stars in the sky. How often had I asked my colleagues to be so bold as to attempt to fathom those endless depths? How often had I been refused? But gazing up at that masterwork of artistry now, I can only imagine how they might have reacted, should they have ever taken the time to count. Surely it would have been impossible, but not for me. I had already counted them, and from that nigh countless collective I had judged and selected some 6 of them, 6 stars, cores of light and hope, and ordered their powers harnessed for our ambition. Standing on Terra, the difference would not be known for some several dozen years at least. And how many do you imagine would ever notice their disappearance? Certainly not the common individual as they strode across their straits. The disappearance of a star or 6 would never faze them. All they could ever notice would be a change in their lifestyle, with the powers that be harnessed, taken entirely under our control, subject in whole to our judgment. There could only be benefit. Wavelength becomes matter, energy becomes mass. Those massive cores condensed into singularities, from which unspeakable accounts of a creationary capability could be drawn. Any material need met in an instant. The generation of a true utopia at hand. We created our own stars, created of a void forged steel, massive constructs upon which we sense billions, nay trillions of individuals to live out their lives. Philosophy and culture mattered not, all changed within instants, countless insights of truth discovered in moments. Scene 3. And all at once, the heavens were parted. And from that abyssal rift, that had once existed only within the realm of philosophy, there flooded forth the overwhelming light of truth. The world was coerced into balance. A justice could not be denied. All were made free from their mortal limitations, and divine might seized control of their very souls. All at once we all were made to bear witness to that which was truly, utterly, wholeheartedly, undeniably, ultimately absolute. Though we yet knew better, such was merely the voice of blasphemy. Scene 4. The power of the heavens were wrested under our control, and unleashed upon the voice of blasphemy. All at once we felt the entire world revolt against us. How dare we attack the one true God? But we allowed them not to faze us. We would not steer away from our path. Blinded as they yet were, they could not see the truth hidden within that blinding veil, the truth that we could see, we could yet see. And we wove that truth into existence for those who wrongfully believed in the voice of blasphemy. And so we made manifest our judgment, and so the voice of blasphemy fell. All at once, those who bore witness to our victory understood. Such a being could not have been a god. No god would have been felled so easily. It could have only been an impostor, and an impostor deserved to be unmasked. They called for us to step forward to take the honor we so deserved, to reveal once and for all what it was we had triumphed over. But for a moment we hesitated. And while I cannot remember why we hesitated, I know that we did. But Eden took our lead. When we stood across reality from the fallen form, each of us hesitated in turn. It was a pathetic form. We couldn't help but doubt if this was truly the voice of blasphemy. It had been far too swift a confrontation. But, as we hesitated, Eden stepped ahead of us unfazed. Neither Luna nor Olivia, the two who had been the obvious choices to make such a blatant approach, but Eden. And, as Eden reached the fallen form, they knelt at the figure's side and... Scene 5. Eden had been kneeling at that time. Perhaps he had felt ill when the rift appeared. They stood and glanced for a moment towards us, and then they stared towards the rift in the sky. The rift was unsettling. It was dark, yet bright, accompanied by sensations of uneven balances, tumultuous justice, freedom bound by chains, and it threatened to lose control of itself. It was a wound in the sky, and it hearkened to a fading memory of having once seen something beyond comprehension. Something was missing. Something had come from that wound. Something that was beyond us. But we couldn't remember it. But Eden stepped toward the rift, confident beyond our comprehension. And so we followed, and so Eden spoke to us. Our task has yet to be completed. Interlude 9. Sapphire's Reminiscence. The Ninth Reverie. Scene 1. I am the one called Sapphire, Argent of the Sea, Governor of Balance. I shall see the world measured and weighed to create equality beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. The ocean is special to me. The sound of the waves as they crash upon the shore. When I had yet to ascend, on the coast is where I lived, and I remember watching the sun set upon those glassy waters. I could always tell when there was to be a storm, or when the weather was to be fair, and I prayed that the ships I witnessed would reach their destination safely. I remember slowly beginning to see so many more ships with their alabaster sails veritably glowing in the sunlight. Perhaps my prayers were working. Mayhap they knew that this coastline was a safe route, with currents benign and winds fair. For all the days of fair weather, however, it made sense to me that there would be days where it would be foul. When the skies turned dark, I would pray that, through those days of foul weather, that there would be no one who would dare travel these waters. And yet one did. I watched silently as a ship sailed through a storm as I prayed them to leave. But the weather would yet turn worse, and all at once those bedraggled sails were torn from their craft, and the whole swallowed by those tempestuous waters. I remember running to the shores at that time, and I happened upon a survivor. They cried out to me then, how had they wronged me so that this may never happen again. And I realized then that they had mistaken me for a spirit. Scene 3. But I prayed to the skies to clear. And so they did. Interlude 10. Rawdon's Reminiscence. The 10th Reverie. I am the one called Rawdon, ardent of the flare, governor of justice. I shall see the world guided by laws that will create virtue beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. I lit a match, and my parents were furious at me. I understood why, but I still felt indignant. So when they weren't around, I lit another match, and another, and another. Flame was fascinating. It seemed to have physical form, but passing a finger through it wouldn't yield any response. Letting a finger stay in the flame, however, it quickly lost sensation. Though perhaps that was why my parents were furious. They took me to a hospital quickly afterwards. I remember the doctor saying that I was lucky to keep the finger, and I had a condition that prevented me from feeling pain. My parents would need to be vigilant in my safety instruction. When my house burned down, I had been in my bed. It was late at night, and I only woke up when I noticed the scent of smoke. It wasn't entirely pleasant to me, and the amount that I noticed was annoying at best. I opened my eyes to see myself surrounded by flames, and I left the house then. My parents were distraught and furious, distraught at my countless third-degree burns and furious to learn that it was arson. Their only comfort was knowing that the arsonist had perished in the flames. I, for one, thought it was an ironic end, and fitting. My parents taught me that fire could destroy lives in very painful ways, not simply through harm but through material loss, and countless lives were put at risk every single time a single flame had lost control. It was an unspeakably vicious act to intentionally set something on fire with the intent to destroy. Scene 3. For that reason, I ignored the arsonist's cries as I left the building. Act 6. Sophia's Reminiscence. The End of Existence. Scene 1. The rift was almost beyond comprehension. Scene 2. When we passed through that bewildering gate, we looked around to see beings that could only be described as silvered. In one moment they seemed like us, but in the corner of our eyes they seemed as if they shone like silver. It was difficult to describe. They were as mirages when we looked away, but they gained tangible form when we looked at them. I reached out to touch one, and they reached out as well, and the place where we touched became like silver for a brief moment. I turned my hand around, and I saw my reflection as the silver slowly faded away. The silver had done the same. There was unusual tension around us, as if a wire had been wound tight and taut, threatening to snap at any moment. I knew then that, if that theoretical wire had snapped, the entire world would have ceased to exist. But at the same time, if that wire had not been so tightly wound, everything would have come undone. Undone in the sense of the word, as if all were comprised of fabric. If that tension had not existed, the fabric would have frayed and there was naught left but strings. The world was in balance, a necessary balance, a precarious balance, and that balance was the world. The silver parted ways for us, and we gradually realized that we were being guided towards something greater. Greater in a sense. It was something that they considered greater. At first glance, there was nothing. Blink once and there were stairs. Twice and they were still there. You can blink as many times as you wished, and they were there. But look away for a moment and they weren't. And as we approached the stairs, something sat in my stomach like a weight. I'm sure it was the same for the others. Scene 3. When we stepped onto those stairs, I knew at that very moment that something indescribable had happened. Something that should have never happened. It was neither good nor was it evil. But perhaps something that had been expected since the beginning. I turned my head as I suppressed the desire to whirl around, and the silver had ceased to move. Still as statues, unmoving, perfect and flawed. I knew then what I didn't want to know. The balance had long been broken. Scene 4. I looked back around my peers, to Luna, Olivia, Varen, Theo, and Robin. I could see that they felt the same lack of balance, or perhaps truth had become lies, philosophy had become sophistry, freedom had become imprisonment, control had become anarchy, and justice had become unfair. And then I looked to Eden, and they had not turned around. They had continued walking up the stairs, and we had already become left behind. They stood now at the top as they reached out to a pair of doors that we hadn't seen before that moment. But then the doors didn't exist either, as Eden reached out toward something that couldn't have been there. It wasn't air, but it wasn't nothing either. It wasn't the void, but it wasn't material. But it was a door, well, it wasn't. We called out to them, and they paused, and they turned to wait for us. And we felt ashamed. But why did we feel ashamed when Eden was our peer? They were our close friend. They wouldn't be furious with us. But why did we think they were furious with us? Something and nothing made true sense and nonsense in perfect and flawless confluence in parallel. All at once the world was a question without answer, and an answer without question. We as well, naught but details to that very paradox. The future we had sought, the dreams we had held, all had become undone. Scene 5. And then I returned to myself. Eden held mine hand in theirs as every fiber of my being threatened to unravel with every passing moment, and they wove me back together. And so they did the same with the others, and their eyes were steely as they encouraged us. Our task is not yet complete. But the end had finally begun to approach. And as they said this, they turned back toward the door that continued to pass in and out of the perception. As I watched their back, and as they reached out towards the door, it was then that I realized I couldn't remember what Eden's face looked like. But perhaps it was only fitting. Eden had already left us far behind, a cosmonaut journeying the stars. The world may have lost its balance, but Eden never lost theirs. Interlude 11. Tara's Reminiscence, the 11th Reverie. Scene 1. I am the one called Tara, ardent of the land, governor of control. I shall see the world ruled by leaders that shall create order beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. The land is honest, so the same is it patient. It returns what is given, and should one give it time, so the same it shall return that time. Alas, the land is generous, and anything that one gives it, the land will return manyfold. A seed will bear fruit, a well to draw water from, and death returns life. I lived my life tending to the land, and I taught my successors to tend it as well. I gave them every lesson that the land taught me, so that they, too, might learn and build upon those lessons. But perhaps I failed to teach them well enough, and soon the land went barren. Criticism and doubt flew around me, all questioning the others, and they eventually turned on to me for, at the very least, a clue. I remained silent as I seasoned my morning meal, and they understood. One of my successors cried out in anguish that they had mistaken salt for fertilizer a month past. Alas, they had hidden their mistake opposed to revealing what they had done, and for that there was nothing more to be done. But just as the land is not unforgiving, I revealed the seeds I had stolen from the fields in the middle of the night. And as I handed them the seeds for them to replant, I revealed that I had also cleansed the fields of their mistake. And so I retired to my quarters for the last time as they set out joyfully to the field. Scene 3. I too would return to the land, but I would not leave them with broken spirits. Interlude 12. Verdant's Reminiscence, the 12th Reverie. Scene 1. I am the one called Verdant, ardent of the sky, governor of freedom. I shall see the world unchained and unbound, and so shall create opportunity beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. In the vicious winds of the storm, I lay on the ground and lamented my pain. How fortunate that I couldn't feel my legs, and I felt not a moment of pain from them. This was fortunate, for my arms were racked with excruciating pain, each having been broken. But even this passed as I consigned myself to fate. Nothing could have been more painful than what I was enduring, and I begged the winds to free me, to end the torment that it had subjected me to end the torment that life itself had subjected me to for all my years. As I prayed, I was struck by a piece of debris and flew, and in that moment my heart leapt. My prayer had been granted, and my death, that death I dreamt of for years, had finally come. But suddenly I saw the sky. I was eventually seen to a hospital, and informed that I was never to walk again. I defied that claim and walked the moment they took off my casts. It was impossible, they said. The damage to my nerves was too severe. But when they looked again, they could only claim that I must have a second set of nerves that they couldn't see. And I sought out storms, and I walked through those blade-like gusts of those whirlwinds to find the center of each. Surrounded by plains, surrounded by flood waters, the roaring howl of wind in parallel with that eerie peacefulness of the eye of the storm. It was there that I found my freedom. Scene 3. For the first time in my life, I had been glad that I had been able to live as long as I had. Act 7. Eden's Reminiscence. The Last Wish. Scene 1. What exactly defines utopia? Scene 2. I know a lot of stories. Stories from perhaps every generation. Stories that were taboo, and stories that were encouraged. Some stories are popular, some stories are boorish. Some were memorable, others forgettable. Stories that were called books, stories that were called comics, stories that were called games, stories that were called music, stories that were called illustrations, stories that were kinetic, and stories that were static, stories that were multilinear, and stories that had no line to speak of, stories and plot lines, and stories and characters, stories that relied on another story to exist, and stories that stood alone, stories that were only ever ideas, and stories that were seen by all. I know a lot of stories, and each story had something to tell. Sometimes I had seen the story before in another shape or form. Sometimes it was something I'd never before heard. Some stories were reimaginings and some were remasters. Some stories were about people and some stories were about events. Some stories spoke of the past, other stories spoke of the present, others still of the future. Some stories spoke of passion, others spoke of logic, and others still of ethics. Some stories were told to spread ideas, and some stories were told simply for the sake of telling a story. I know a lot of stories. Many countless, desperate stories, garbed in wishes and hopes that we, too, might attain what could only be imagined. It would be impossible to describe each and every one of them, at least not in the time that I have now as we approach the end of the world. But this world will not end. I shall see to that fact. But I digress. I know a lot of stories, and so many of those stories have spoken of dystopia, and so many have spoken of utopia. Scene 3. What exactly defines utopia? I've asked once and I'll ask again. and I'll ask once again, and I'll ask again, and I'll ask as many times as I have to until I learn the answer. One would think that the answer is a perfect society. I know that such perfection is impossible, or at least impossible for any group greater than one individual. An individual's unique values are specific to an individual's unique values are specific to that individual. Even then, it would only be a matter of time until that individual's process of thought changed until utopia is no longer utopia, and so utopia cannot exist, not because of logical reasons, but because of the intrinsic nature of the individual. But that would be a reality too sad to accept. Scene 4. With my peers at my side, I approached the heavens raised high, or perhaps they were the heavens laid low. I saw 6 brilliant figures, 3 to a side and each flanking an absolute one. The 6 were distressed, and the one was above. I was the same. 3 of my peers to one side, 3 to another, and they too were distressed. But there was no need for them to worry, and I bade them good fortune and peace. And the 6 brilliant figures grew peaceful, and so did my peers grow peaceful. And the absolute one stood. What exactly defines utopia? I've asked before, but now I have an answer. Utopia is. The flaws of an imperfect world shape an individual, and the flaws of an imperfect individual trying desperately to understand the world defines the world. There is no need to search for utopia, because it already is. All that is required for utopia is a simple wish, that all may find balance, justice, control, and freedom through philosophy and truth. And most of all, an undying wish that all may find paradise. To use the words of that fallen angel, the angel that had long ceased to exist, Elysium requires only an ardent wish to create heaven on earth. Scene 5. Elysium requires only an ardent wish to create heaven on earth. Interlude 13. Onyx's Reminiscence. The 13th Reverie. Scene 1. I am the one called Onyx, ardent of the dark, governor of philosophy. I shall see the world through all avenues of thought that shall create wisdom beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. I attended the dance clad in black, as was always my style. Every day that I had attended to work in class I had worn black, so wearing black even to this dance was to be expected. The one difference, however, was that I had worn, for once, something I saw as beautiful as opposed to practical, and the hem of my dress swirled around me as I strode through those doors, and it danced with me as I spun, as opposed to the practical clothes that hung close to me in an endeavor to stay out of the way. I remember every word that was spoken to me at that moment, and the dress has since taken up a position gathering dust, locked in that moment, frozen in time. I remember the compliments I was paid. So the same I remember the ridicule I endeavored. That as I looked fantastic I was told the clothes didn't belong on me. That I was impossibly brave, disgustingly perverted, absolutely gorgeous, utterly revolting. And I look upon that outfit and remember every word, and how fascinating a feeling that it elicits in me, and how fascinating that I understand where every word comes from. Scene 3. A smile filled with joy, almost suppressed by anguished tears, but only almost. Interlude 14. Loomis's Reminiscence. The Last Reverie. Scene 1. I am the one called Loomis, ardent of the light, governor of truth. I shall see the world through fiction unto fact, and shall create logic beyond mortal comprehension. Scene 2. My shower room was dark. The light bulb had broken several times, and I could not be bothered to fix it. I had taken many showers in that dark, and I had grown used to it, to a point that it was discomforting to take a shower with any light on. I would cover up the windows to ensure that the light pollution from the street lights, the stars, and the moon would not bother me. I only took showers at night, because the sun was difficult to completely block out. I closed my eyes in the shower as well. Only true darkness would suffice. At first it was difficult, and I wished for the light. As time passed, as I took more showers, I memorized the layout of the shower room. I extended this beyond the shower room, and soon to my entire house. Perhaps it was dangerous, perhaps it was silly, but the light of day was overwhelming, and the darkness saw me comfort. And in that darkness I came to understand what it meant to know something, having to learn something countless times before eventually coming to know what was true. When I opened my eyes again, I was disappointed by what I saw in the light, nothing but shadows of what I already knew was true. Scene 3. I came to understand what it meant to understand someone, how impossible it truly was. Finale. The Will of the Eternia. So, you made it this far in the end. Eden will soon follow behind me. It happened to the one who came before me, and it will happen to Eden as well. The Ardens have already passed on who they were to Eden's friends. As for the one who disappeared, for their dream to come true, their disappearance was a necessary step. Even I cannot remember their name. Me, who knew them from the very beginning, who transcended alongside them. What a disgrace I am. And as every second passes, more of them fades from me. But it would seem that Eden still remembers, whatever they were. At the very least, however, Eden has taken up their mantle. For that, I am glad. I know that you will eventually speak with Eden. It's just a matter of when. I could tell you when, but that would spoil the surprise. I would rather you wait with bated breath for the day that Eden speaks to you as I am now. Of course, it'd be just as entertaining to watch you wait, only for Eden to never to speak with you. But I'm not that mischievous. Eden will speak to you, and I know that you will hear. All of this space to work with, and yet all I want to try and do is speak to you a parting message. How cliché. How eager I am to leave, but I have all the time in the world, as ephemeral as that time is. But perhaps I don't have any time left. Perhaps I should do what the other Ardents did. If I remember correctly, they desperately called out their names and went to find them. Their creeds, perhaps? Perhaps they were desperately hoping you would remember them. How benevolent if you would be, if you remembered them. But how rare is it for anyone to remember the name of every character in a story? Aside from the main characters, I mean. I wonder, who do you think are the main characters of the story? I wonder, who do you think are the main characters of this story? Though, if I dare say, while I don't quite like the idea of considering all of our existence to be imagined as part of a story, it's certainly possible. And I am speaking to you, after all. Maybe it's the truth. I'd like to think that I was the main character, but anyone would disagree, even me. Thinking of it that way, I have to be honest. I always thought that, at the end of these pages, I would continue to exist as I always have. Everything would continue on as normal, even if. I'm not ready for the story to end. I'm scared of what lies on the other side. I hope everything continues on as normal, but even though I am me, I cannot see what lies on the other side. Perhaps that's just proof that this is indeed the end of the story, and the end of the world. And that would mean that person's dream would never come to pass. Ah, how unfair. I failed to foresee this. Perhaps I am not as transcendent as I thought I was. But perhaps that person knew this would happen. I think I like that idea. Very well then, I shall consign myself to the fate that they foresaw. I shall go into the dark with full courage, and so shall the rest of the world, if it must needs be. But if you would allow me this one selfishness, then I would like to imitate the ardents who came before me. I am the one called Afara. I am not anything special, but I, like Elysium, wanted to see the world to the future that I was never privileged to see. A future that has no end. Ad infinitum. Ah, I remembered their name at the very... Prelude. At the end of the world, the two yet remained. They were surrounded by other children, other adults. The rest huddled together as the ground trembled and ruptured. A prayer to whatever gods they believed in, that they may be spared that fabled apocalypse, that prophesied revelation. Beyond those prayers, however, was resignation. The ground opened up beneath them, and half their number was swallowed by the unforgiving, ailing earth. The refuge split in half unveiled the sky, empty as the night, even as the sun shone down overhead. Those who remained cried in pain as they stood under that glare. The shadows returned as the fail-safe polarizers sprang into action. All understood, however, that those measures only forestayed the inevitable. For in those empty skies they saw their vaunted arcs fall, the greatest technologies they could muster, perfections of materials never before realized, preparations were made for an inevitability, but one far lesser than they now faced. And nary a one found themselves surprised. How suddenly the end had come. But when they looked to the skies to see that spoken divine judgment, they found nothing, and there remained nothing, and that nothing consumed all, and that nothing cared not for good nor evil. The nothing was absolute. And they observed the end, but they did not fear it. And how many countless others did not fear it? How many others embraced it? How many others were apathetic towards it? How many others had known that they would be consumed by the end? And so that last refuge was consumed. And all at once there remained none. At the end of the world, the two yet remained. The two were not unique, and yet the nothing passed them by. They remained quiet, and they came to a decision. The world would continue, and the first wandered among the souls of the perished. They found sick souls suffused with concepts and ripped them from the abyss. And they let them sleep as they wandered further. But they could never find the last concept they were searching for. All at once the first realized that concept had died as the world came to an end. A hope for paradise. Paradise had been lost to them for the rest of eternity. However, as the first trembled and shocked, the second stepped forward. With a single movement, the ailing earth was healed. The color returned to the sky as the shattered land was stitched anew. The boiled seas condensed once more. The stars returned to their benign selves. All at once, an existence had been made unsundered. And so the second's light dimmed as they expended that power. The first cried out in fear and frustration. The second had gone too far. Whereas once they had been brilliant, they had become merely like silver. How fragile their existence had become. And so the first wept. But the second laughed. They proclaimed that they would create paradise on earth. All they needed was an ardent wish, the very same that they nurtured. They would wait as long as they needed to. And so the two, Ifara and Elysium, remained at the end of the world, ad terminum.